Thank you very much for joining us with another story here at Annie Narrates. Today's story's title goes like this. Bio parents who abandoned me 19 years ago came back crawling because dad wants a kidney from me as his health is deteriorating and threatening to sue me if I refuse. So for context, I, 29 male, was raised by my maternal grandparents after my parents abandoned me. They terminated their rights once I was 10 years old, and after that, I just pretty much never saw them again until recently. Honestly, even when they left me, I didn't really feel that bad, because even before that, I was pretty much being raised by my grandparents because my parents were hardly around. They liked the whole traveling nomadic lifestyle, and for some reason, they believed that they couldn't do that with a kid. Sometimes I would even find myself wondering why they even had me if they didn't want me. They would ignore me whenever I was at home and only did the bare minimum for as long as I used to live with them. And after that, they randomly decided that they didn't want me anymore, so they left me with my grandparents and took off. They wouldn't even send me money, and it was my grandparents who did everything for me. I am grateful for all they did, because I don't think I would have survived without them. My grandparents didn't keep in touch with my mom and dad after they left because they thought that what they did was horrifying and irresponsible, so they cut ties with them. I never saw my parents again, but I did hear that they were traveling all around the world and were living their lives to the fullest. They didn't attend family events or come back for the holidays and were completely disconnected from everyone. The only way people would get to know about them was by stalking their social media. They would constantly post about the exotic locations that they were in, and I did feel bad about it occasionally because it felt like I was a burden to my grandparents and also to my parents, and that's why they left me. But then I would talk to my grandparents and they would make me feel better about it. So, after a few years, I just stopped thinking about my parents as my family and that the only family that I had was with me, and the ones who weren't had nothing to do with me. It's been a long time since then, and I am now an investment banker with my own life, my own family, and I hardly ever even think about my parents because they never were a significant part of my life to begin with. My grandparents and I still live together, but that's possibly because I moved into a much bigger house and everybody has their own rooms. My wife loves my grandparents more than her own folks, and it's just a picture-perfect family. My son actually refers to my grandparents as his grandparents, which is weird, but sweet, so we don't correct him. They're getting old, and I want to make the most of as much time as I have with them. Now, last week, my grandparents told me that my parents had reached out to them, and they wanted to speak to me in person, but didn't know how to get through me. I told them that I didn't want to speak to them, but my grandpa said that it seemed urgent, so I agreed to meet with them, and we arranged a meeting at the hotel that they were staying in. The last time I heard from them was when a relative of mine told me that they were living in Norway for a couple of months before they took off again, and that was a couple of years ago. After that, I got too busy to keep track of them anymore. So now, when I met my parents, after almost 19 years, I really didn't know what to expect, so I took my wife along with me for emotional support. When we went up to the room in the hotel, my mother was the one who opened the door and hugged me, which I found very weird because she didn't even do that to me when I was a kid, and it felt strange to hug her back. But the real shock was still yet to come, because when I saw my father, I could barely even recognize the man. He was a shell of a human being and looked nothing like the pictures and memories I had of him. He was extremely thin and looked borderline malnourished, and I could see the bags under his eyes. I just felt like I was looking at a very sick person, and then I started feeling more and more nervous rather than uneasy or uncomfortable, because I knew that there was some bad news that they had to share with me, which is why they had called me here so out of the blue. I took a seat on the couch along with my wife, and we made small talk for a while and tried to pretend like all of this was normal. But then, eventually, my mother stopped beating around the bush and told me very seriously that my father's health was deteriorating and she needed my help. I thought she was talking about financial help or something, which I was ready to provide for her, because even though she and my father hadn't been the best parents, I still had a heart and I couldn't just abandon people and treat them the same way that they treated me. But she said that this was not about money, and that my dad had enough of his own. She actually wanted me to donate a kidney to my father to save him, and while she didn't know if I would be a match or not, I was his only biological son. So they were hoping that I would be willing to at least find out if we were a match, and then, if we were, I could go ahead and save his life. My dad had always had heart issues, and in recent times, everything had just become worse for him health-wise, which had led to kidney failure. And now, he was in desperate need of a transplant as soon as possible. So, my parents had come to me for help, because I was the only person that they could look to. I am not exactly proud of the way that I reacted, because I completely freaked out and told my mother that she was crazy for even thinking that I would agree to this. And then I went off on a rant about how she and my father had abandoned me for years and never even bothered to check in on me and find out how I was doing. But now, almost 2 decades later, they were back and they expected me to just hand them over my kidney like it was no big deal. I told them that I couldn't do any of it, even if I wanted to, because now I had a family of my own, and I was not going to put my health at risk with something like this. It sucked for them that my dad was going through something so horrible, but I couldn't help them now, and I was sorry, but that was my final decision. Then I stormed out of the room and out of the hotel with my wife behind me, and didn't even wait for them to say anything, because I was just freaking out and having a meltdown. I realized then that my mom's hug and my parents expressing so much interest in my life were all fake. They didn't care. They just wanted a kidney from me and were trying to establish some relationship with me before the big ask. My wife and I didn't say anything on the drive back home and just stayed quiet until we were finally back home. And I only opened up about it a couple of hours later when my grandparents came into my room to ask me what the meeting was all about. Our son was napping, so my wife also came into our room for that discussion, and I repeated everything that had taken place in the hotel and told my grandparents that I was not going to talk to my parents after this, no matter what. That's when my wife finally spoke up and said that she believed I was being a little too hasty, and she thinks that I should at least get the test done and find out if we actually are a match, or try to talk to them, get to know their situation better, and then come to a decision. Because this is something really serious, and I shouldn't just act out on my emotions because it involves somebody's life. My grandparents didn't say anything, but I was furious that my wife even believed that I should consider giving up a kidney for my father, the guy who had never even bothered to actually be a father to me. She'd lost our parents when she was very little, in a car crash, and had never even known them. She had been raised by her dad's sister and her husband, but unfortunately, they weren't as kind as my grandparents and had kicked her out as soon as she turned 18. They'd only taken her in so they could take the money to raise her from her father's funds. So this was a touchy subject for her. But I feel like her situation was completely different from mine, and my parents were just plain selfish. She couldn't exactly compare the two things, and yet, she did, and told me that she would have given up anything to have her parents back in her life, at least for a while. And here I was, being presented with a chance to save my dad's life and do something good, but I was rejecting it. She didn't think that it was completely fair, so she wanted me to at least think about it and consider giving it a shot because I could very well be my dad's last hope. And then my wife and I got into a really bad argument over it, which is why we haven't been talking to each other ever since that day. And it's been almost a week, so that's quite a long time. My grandparents said that these two situations weren't exactly the same, but they could understand where my wife was coming from, and they could also understand my reluctance to help my parents out because I had a family of my own to look after, and a kidney transplant was a very big deal. They were pretty diplomatic about the whole thing and didn't give me an answer on what to do, but I don't really blame them, because this is something where even I don't know what to do. About 2 days after the meeting, I received an email from my parents where they were threatening to file a lawsuit against me if I didn't donate my kidney to my father, which was ridiculous because I don't even think that they would have any grounds to do that. But I knew that they were just desperate and were trying to scare me, so I didn't think too much of it. And that was followed by more emails, each one more desperate than the last. It's been a week, like I said, and I still haven't been able to come to a conclusion about what I should do. My wife isn't talking to me, my grandparents are confused, and my parents just keep sending me email after email to try and convince me to agree to something so big. And I have just zero clue on what to do. I know that I could save somebody's life, and that if my father actually ends up passing away from this, I will never be able to forgive myself for that or get it off my conscience. But at the same time, I don't want to put myself at any risk in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. Am I the a-hole for not wanting to donate a kidney to my father? Hi everyone, I just want to thank you guys before I get into what happened and appreciate everybody for their comments and support in the DMs. It means a lot to me, especially given the circumstances, which are not ideal as of now. But I'm happy to inform you guys that it's getting better because I did talk to my wife. I realized that this was probably just as difficult for her as it was for me, if not more, because she actually lost her parents. My parents were just selfish jerks and she didn't even get the chance to know them before they were gone. So this obviously brings up some issues for her, and I should be a little more sensitive about it than that, which I wasn't being. I was just thinking about myself, and I guess she was doing the same, kind of a little bit. The point is, both of us were being a little self-involved and weren't thinking about the other person, which is what landed us into this mess. But we cleared the air yesterday and had a genuine heartfelt conversation, so we're doing better now. She told me that she was being selfish and I said the same. And honestly, this is not even the point of the problem right now. We have bigger things to worry about, like what we're going to do about my dad because he is definitely not doing well if we are to go by what my mother is telling us in her emails. His health is steadily declining and his doctors are gunning for a transplant in the next few months, or he might not make it. I've been thinking about it, and I really don't want to go through the procedure. I don't even want to get the test done to check if we are a match or not, because in case we are, which is pretty likely, then I will know for sure that I could have saved him, but I didn't on purpose, and I don't want that to be on my conscience, so I really don't think that I'm going to go through with this. And my biggest problem with this decision was that my wife wasn't on board with it, but now that she's okay, I really don't think that I need to prove how selfless and wonderful of a human being I am. I guess it does make me kind of a bad person, but I don't know what else to do. I wish somebody saved my dad because it would be the right thing to do, and he is on the waiting list, but I don't think I can be that guy for him. I have a family of my own to think of. For the last few days, I'd been struggling to come up with a way to tell my mom that I wasn't going to get the test done to see if my dad and I were a match. Yesterday, I realized that there was no right way to do it, and there's never going to be a good time for it. This was horrible news, and I would just have to rip off the band-aid and get it done with. So I called her on the number that she'd send me and just told her that she needed to stop sending me emails because I wasn't going to change my mind. The guilt trip that she was trying to induce wasn't helping. I told her that a kidney transplant was no joke, and I wished that I had the courage or the generosity to go through with it for my father's sake, but I didn't, and she just needed to accept that. Also, I barely even knew them anymore, so it wasn't like I was declining to help my dad. He just happened to be related to me by blood, but he had never really been a father to me, so they couldn't exactly play that card. My mother was quiet for a while, and then she told me that I should be ashamed of myself because the things that I was saying were horrible, and she couldn't believe that she was having to hear this from her own flesh and blood. She said that my father was literally so sick that he couldn't even do anything for himself, and yet, I was choosing this very moment to remind them what awful parents they had been. She then went on to tell me that the only reason that they abandoned me was because they knew that I would be well taken care of. Apparently, my parents did not even plan on having a baby. But when my mom got pregnant, she thought that she would give it a shot, but it wasn't exactly the way that she imagined it to be, and she quote-unquote lost interest, as did my father. After a while, they decided that it would be in my best interest if I grew up with my grandparents instead, and to minimize the trouble that they caused me, they cut themselves out of my life entirely. She made it sound like she had done a huge favor to me by not abandoning me at an orphanage and letting me get adopted by my parents instead. But the truth was that the credit for this went to my grandparents and not to her or my father. So I didn't even know what she was going on about. The mental gymnastics to prove that she was actually a great human being was crazy, and I found that entire conversation to be pretty ridiculous. She kept insisting that I was being a horrible son, and a little while later, I got tired of arguing, so I told her that I was just being the same kind of selfish as my father had been, and then disconnected the call. She hasn't tried to contact me since that phone call, but I'm sure that she will eventually, and this definitely isn't over yet. So when the guilt trip didn't work, my mother went straight to her parents and tried to change their minds instead. My grandparents are a lot older now, and they are much softer at heart than I am. So they entertained my mother's attempts to get them to change my mind. My mother called them. I don't know how she got their number, but she did somehow. I guess that's how desperate she is right now. But anyway, she called them and apparently apologized to them for just abandoning me with them and taking off with her husband. She told them her sob story and expected some sympathy from them, which she did receive. But then she told them to try and convince me to change my mind about the transplant, to which my grandparents said that they couldn't do that unfortunately. She kept begging them to at least talk to me and knock some sense into me, but my grandparents were diplomatic there too. They said that they could try, but they weren't sure if I would agree to it or not, but my mother was ready to take those chances. And so, my grandparents told me about the phone call with my mom, but of course, they couldn't change my mind. To me, it's almost as if I'm being asked to give up my kidney for some random person, because I don't even know my dad anymore. But what I do know is that he's not the kind of human being that I want to be in touch with, even if he is extremely sick. My wife thinks that they're going too far, which I'm glad to hear because this means that she actually and genuinely is on my side. She told me a couple of days ago that she had lost her parents when she was very little, so she never even got to know them. But I knew my parents, and if I decided that I wasn't going to help them out despite that, even under dire circumstances like these, then I must have my reasons, and I think that's a pretty great way to put it. But to be honest, this has more to do with the health issues and my fear of anything to do with hospitals in general. I think I made it pretty clear that I'm not the biggest fan of hospitals or surgeries, and I'm definitely not a fan of thinking about having to live my entire life with just one kidney. And I don't think I want to take those chances at any cost. So this is more about me than about revenge or whatever, because that would actually be pretty bad. I think my parents are going back to traveling. I can't be sure of it, but I ran into an uncle of mine at the mall today, and while we were talking, he told me that he heard from my mother recently, but he wasn't able to meet her. And she told him that she was leaving in a couple of days. She hasn't mentioned that to me, so I don't know what that's about. Now that I think of it, I was never even able to find out how exactly were my parents able to afford so much, because I don't think they have proper jobs. And they never sent me money while I was growing up, so I have no idea of the kind of money that they have. But my mother did mention that they had enough to cover a kidney transplant and wasn't too worried, so I'm guessing that they're comfortable. My grandparents don't know either because I've asked them a couple of times and they've never had an answer. I'm beginning to think that maybe they do have a job. I just don't know anything about it, and now they probably have to go back to their lives. I'm curious but don't know how to find out the truth because I certainly cannot talk to them, and this is just a theory. But I guess I'll just have to make do with it, or maybe I'll tell my uncle to find out more about it. About a week has passed since my last update, and I haven't been in touch with my mother for quite some time now. She stopped texting me or emailing me after the last phone call that we had, so I was pretty relieved because I thought that the nightmare was finally over. But I guess the nightmare is going to be over now, since she sent me another email. Probably the last one, saying that she and my father were going back to where they lived before. They didn't mention the place, but I'm guessing it might be in Norway or maybe in some other European country. but definitely not in the States. She told me that I was a terrible son and that she wished nothing but the worst for me, which is understandable, I guess. She also said that she was sick and tired of wasting her time chasing after me and trying to change my mind because now she knew that I didn't have a heart, so there was no point in trying to talk to me. It just never made any sense to me. There were a lot of other horrible things that she said to me which I don't think are worth repeating here, but the worst of it was at the very end, where he told me that she wished something bad would happen to me in the future as well, and then when I needed it the most, my son would also turn his back on me, and then I would probably understand how my parents feel right now. That got on my nerves, because I think I'd made it very clear that this was not the reason I was declining. Revenge was not my motive. My only reason was that hospitals and the idea of surgery freaked me out. And also, on second thought, maybe if they had been better parents to me, then I wouldn't have turned my back on them, and I would have at least tried to face my fears, but they just weren't worth it. My son doesn't hate me, and neither does he think of me as a bad guy because the thing is, I didn't abandon my son the way they did. So I have nothing to worry about because I am certainly not my parents. I was going to send this to them, but like I said, they just aren't worth it. So I didn't, and I just blocked them on email as well, so yeah, the nightmare is officially over. Alright guys, that was a wrap up for today's story. Thank you very much for listening. Go ahead and smash that like button for me, and subscribe for more stories. Thanks again, we'll be seeing you in the next one.